Let me ask you a question. Have smartphones and social media actually made our lives better? Don't get me wrong. I get it. Okay. On the one hand, these little devices and the apps that they connect to are truly magical from a certain perspective. Instant global connectivity in the palm of your hands. The sorts of entertainment, music, and visuals that would have been unimaginable, unthinkable for anyone, including royalty, only a few generations ago. Instant access to virtually all of human intelligence, history, culture, knowledge, ever, with the swipe of a finger. As I've said, magical. But on the other hand, it's hard not to notice that these incredible devices, for all of their many benefits, come with a price. And it's a price that's hard to quantify. In fact, the monetary cost of smartphones and social media is probably the least controversial thing about them. The dramatic change in our social interactions, the childhoods which have been fundamentally altered since the emergence of a few specific technologies, all within my lifetime. The ever-expanding reach of smartphones and social media into every fabric of our social existence. Well, it's an experiment that we're seeing play out in real time. And I'll say this, not all for the better. With that, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unconditional with Norby Schickel. Today, we are going deep into this issue of smartphones, social media, and the anxious generation, an exceptional book by Jonathan Haidt. I'll say this right from the start, that this is a book that has had a profound impact on my thinking. Okay, I've teased this episode for a while, and it's finally time to get into it. So if you've been with me before, thank you for your patience on the subject. I'm glad to have you back. If you are new to the show, new to the channel, it's good to have you as well. The aim of this show, my mission with this podcast, if you will, is to reclaim radical health and fitness in the modern world. That's not always easy. So this subject, the subject of smartphones and social media, and our relationship to these technologies is of huge importance. And while this topic is serious, and we're going to talk about some very distressing, I think it's fair to say dark aspects of social media and of smartphones, this is not a black pill gloom and doom episode. Okay, I'll say that right from the start. I am incredibly optimistic about the future, including a future that makes room for these technologies without destroying the very way of life that makes life worth living. Okay, so stick around. It's going to get a little rocky, as I said, a little dark at times, but there is much, much light at the end of this tunnel. For this conversation, we are going to rely heavily on the work of Professor Jonathan Haidt and his book, The Anxious Generation. If you are unfamiliar with Jonathan Haidt, he's a social psychologist, professor at NYU. He's the author of many best-selling books, including The Happiness Hypothesis, which I'm reading now, The Coddling of the American Mind, and The Anxious Generation, to name a few. He is one of the leading, and I would say the most thoughtful and articulate voices that I've heard warning against the dangers of smartphones and social media. He's been a guest on many large podcasts, including Joe Rogan Experience, Modern Wisdom Podcast, and many others. If you have yet to hear him speak, or you've yet to read The Anxious Generation, definitely go remedy that. Okay, I'm tempted to say that especially if you have kids, but no, okay, especially if you have a pulse, okay, especially if you're a human being. This book is for everyone, and I do mean everyone. These topics, many of which we are going to discuss today, are incredibly important. So I'm going to plug this book like my life depends on it, because in many ways, the future of humanity depends on individuals like me and like you grappling with and waking up to many of the concepts and ideas and uncomfortable truths that are presented in this book. In this conversation, we're going to discuss Haidt's thesis on the convergence of smartphones and social media, the shift in the typical childhood experience from what Haidt refers to as a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, and the meteoric rise in rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. And we're going to discuss how these technologies specifically harm boys versus girls. The harms are slightly different based on the gender. and based on averages. And we're going to discuss why these technologies seem to be particularly harming to preteens and teenagers. Many of these subjects are uncomfortable to think about, let alone talk about. I totally get it. But my own view is that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the more that we understand the nature of the problem, the more that we can come up with solutions and ideas to protect ourselves, our families, and our loved ones. The situation is both worse than many of us probably imagine, but the good news is that so much of this is within our control as parents, as guardians, and frankly, as humans who care about the future of the civilization, okay? The future of society. Again, I really believe that it is that important. So let's go a bit deeper on this point and let's talk context. Why does this matter? Why is this topic so important, especially from the perspective of health, right? This is a show that you could say health, fitness. Why are we talking about social media and cell phones? Okay. Why does this matter? Why is this issue so important? Now, we've discussed this before, but I often find myself asking the question, are we better off? We are told, and in general, I agree, that we are living at the high watermark of human technology. And that technology has been designed and is supposed to make our lives better. But the obvious question is that true? Like, are we actually better off? In fact, that question, are we better off, was the subject of an entire episode that I did, I don't know, episode 8, 9, something like that, where I examined this question. Are we better off as human beings? Has modern society, including all of the many benefits, antibiotics, advanced medicine, nanotechnology, incredible communications, safety in the modern world, absolutely, there have been some incredible benefits. But I think it's fair to say that there have been some significant costs too. And while the benefits are very obvious, my assertion is that at times the costs are not quite so obvious. So the question really becomes, on net, right? When you balance out both the pros and the cons, the benefits and the costs, where are we? Where do we stand as a civilization on this deeper question of, are we better off? And if we're not better off on net, or if we find that we're actually worse off in some specific way or ways, isn't it our responsibility, our obligation, to think critically, to speak up, and to try to correct the areas where maybe we went a bit off the rails? I think so. I do. And the good news is that I'm not alone here. There's a growing movement of people, from concerned parents to people intent on guarding their own attention span and psyche, to teens themselves who are recognizing that while these devices and tools can be incredibly powerful, they can be incredibly damaging as well. And that dichotomy, both the unprecedented power of smartphones and social media, as well as the potential for bringing out some of the worst in us, is one of the reasons that ditching them completely, for most people, is a non-starter, can be included. It's hard to imagine going back to physical maps and cassette tapes in a world of GPS and streaming music. There is clearly a place for smartphones and social media in the adult world. But what about the world of young people? And at what age? We're going to go in depth on this. But for now, I think it's fair to say that when it comes to young people, children in particular, the calculus is much different. And one of the reasons why this conversation is so difficult is that this is what many would describe as a collective action problem. Smartphones and social media are beyond the control of you and your family, especially when you factor in the typical school setting. Even if you and your family decide to limit or restrict access to smartphones or to social media, what about their friends and their families? What about just some random kid on the bus, after class, or on the playground? Think of all of the incredibly dark, disturbing information, pictures, and videos that are available on the internet and provide instant, free, and unfettered access in the hands of any kid at school. It's an uncomfortable thought. Also at the core of this subject is an issue which I personally am starting to recognize is maybe the hallmark of our modern world, the common thread, which runs pretty much through all of the challenges that we face as individuals. And that is that more so than any generation of the past, we have to actively choose the difficult path. We have to choose to do hard things. Let me explain what I mean. I'll give you a couple examples. Food. Let's take food. Generations of the past, for them, taste, for most part, was a signal of nutrient density, that the food was, quote, good for you, by and large. Today, almost the opposite is true. Taste has been hijacked by large food companies, not to promote health of the consumer in some natural, co-evolved, or co-designed symbiotic relationship, but as a way to boost profits. Movement. Movement in the past was just part of life. Walking, working the farm, tracking game, foraging, the exact type of movement that our bodies are designed to do, which actively promotes health and longevity, was simply part of going about your day. There was no separate category called working out. Maybe except in the case of a soldier or an athlete, but certainly not the average person, certainly not as a minimum standard to remain metabolically healthy. I want you to think about that. Let's take one more. Entertainment. Entertainment in the past had community at its core, be it a play, a dance, telling stories, or simply singing while you worked. Entertainment was pro-social. It bound communities and people and families together. And the more vivid the entertainment, generally, the more so it did that, the more so that it bound people together socially. And of course, entertainment, by this very nature, was somewhat limited. Actually, compared to today, quite limited. But so much of today's entertainment, from Netflix to music with headphones to dancing to a video game, is solitary. It's designed to be consumed and experienced alone and in large quantities. You might even say unlimited quantities, if so desired. And to me, this shift is profound. The point is that while it's tempting to hold past generations in higher esteem because of their greater toughness, fitness, or just overall badassery, it's also important to remember that those conditions that forged those people, for the most part, were imposed externally, not selected voluntarily. And I do think that difference is meaningful. We are living at a time in which I believe, and this is my own bias here, but that choosing difficult things, saying no to some or even much of the convenience offered by the modern world, is not optional. It is necessary to build, to lead, and to live a long, healthy, and actualized life. It's tempting to think that we modern humans are lazy, or that we lack self-control, or that we're flawed. Maybe. But my contention is that more so than any generation in the past, we have to say no. Things have gotten so convenient, so entertaining, so distracting and addicting that we have to go against our instincts, against our design, our evolution, if you will, and say no to so many things that never would have been an option in the past. There would have been natural barriers, natural limits to things that would have caused overindulgence, overconsumption, overaddiction. That's no longer the case. By my assessment, we are the first era of humanity that has to actively reject so many forms of taste, experience, and convenience. We have to go against the adage of work smarter and not harder. I mean, think about that. Point to another time in human history where that's been the case. Rather than being imposed through external factors, we have to choose hard. We have to choose to do hard things, choose to cook our own food, expend energy to safeguard our attention, not simply allow AI to slowly become the outsourced decision maker in your life, to dedicate non-working time to working out, right? All of this, by my assessment, is completely new, and the consequences of not getting it right are incredibly high. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. That is the why. That's why I believe this is such an important subject for all thinking people to wrap their heads around. And I'll say it again, especially if you have children, okay, which I do. I've got young children. And the good news is I've spoken to so many parents who are already on board with this. They've already thought about this. Many of them have even read The Anxious Generation. Okay, so I would be optimistic anyways, but I'm very optimistic in light of some of the conversations I've been having. So let's get into it. Let's understand Haidt's thesis at a high level, and then we're going to drill into some specifics. And that is that the introduction of two key innovations in the last 15 years, smartphones and a particular form of social media, have led to a significant decline in the well-being of young people, particularly teenagers. That the introduction and mass adoption of these technologies has literally rewired our children's brains, and the downsides and the risks of these technologies has either been ignored, downplayed, or in some cases, deliberately hidden from the public. That companies like Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, have knowingly exploited the vulnerability of young people to hijack their attention, collect, market, and sell their data to the highest bidder. That around the same time of these new, powerful, and unprecedented technologies' emergence with respect to the virtual world, a movement towards overprotection in the real world took hold among parents, teachers, and schools. That while the real world has become de-risked, boring, and neutered, at the same time, the online world has become highly engaging, highly addictive, and increasingly dangerous, thus moving the typical childhood experience from what Haidt and others refer to as a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And this 1-2 combo, hypervigilance and overprotection in the real world, combined with essentially zero guardrails in the virtual world, and we're going to get into some of that, is hitting young people very hard. It's affecting both girls and boys, but in a different way, with girls unfortunately being hit the hardest. Full disclosure, I'll say right from the beginning that throughout this conversation, I'm going to largely agree with Haidt and his thesis. By and large, I think he's nailed it. Okay, I really think he's done humanity and me personally a service, so I'm very grateful. As I've said from the beginning, this is by no means a gloom and doom, black pill sort of an episode. Okay, many, many reasons to be optimistic, and Haidt offers many of them in his book. But if I were going to offer one criticism and tease part of the future solution, the antidote, if you will, to righting this ship, I do think that there's one key aspect that Haidt may have missed. So I'll tease that right now, but you're going to want to stick around for that. Okay, very, very important. Now, of course, we should say from the start that not everyone agrees with or is going to agree with what Haidt presents. I admit that I probably have a natural bias towards Haidt's ideas. So we should keep that in mind. And we should consider counter-arguments to what Haidt has to say. And I think maybe the strongest counterpoint to what Haidt presents is that, well, this is kind of what every generation of parents starts to think, right? That something must have changed in the young people of today. That maybe things were better, that maybe things have gotten especially bad. And you can see this play out throughout history, right? Whether it was the emergence of rock and roll music, whether it's video games in the early 80s, whether it's baggy jeans, whether it's tight jeans, whether it's ripped jeans, right? It's always easy for generations to look down at the generations that are coming after them and say, something has changed and things are getting worse. And that maybe things were better in the past. And maybe this knee-jerk reaction to look at change is automatically bad, should be challenged. And that generations just like me have looked at the generation coming up and have said, hang on, I think something is about to go off the rails, and it never did. Okay. I think that's a fair criticism. For people who are in their 40s and 50s, I mean, we all grew up with video games and eventually the internet and cell phones, of course. There were people warning that all of these things were going to rot your brain. They were going to lead to the erosion of health and the downfall of civilization as we know it. And by and large, that didn't happen. Okay. For the most part, we all turned out kind of all right. Okay. So the obvious question is this different, right? Or is this more of the same? The Chicken Little, sky is falling. This is the beginning of the end. Is what we're describing here something truly different? And Haidt tackles this point head on and says that yes, there is something that is categorically different here. Something fundamentally changed in the social and technological landscape, leading to real, dramatic, and terrible outcomes for young people. And we know what the change is, and we know when it happened. And it's not an illusion. We can actually see it in the data. So what is it? As I've described before, it is two important changes. First, the emergence of smartphones with apps. Okay, I've intentionally and will continue to try to say smartphones as opposed to cell phones because that's important. These are not simple text and call devices. We're talking full access to the internet, full access to apps, full access to social media, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Unless my birth year. Because, by the way, I'm a leap year baby. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah. Leap year. So every now and again, 366. And don't forget it, especially if you listen to this show. Second is a shift in the very nature of social media, moving from a means of connecting with friends and people that you know. For example, college students, right? When you think about the original Facebook, you had to have, I believe it was a .edu and be associated with a college or a university. So moving from that form of social media, people that you know, to a means of potentially, and maybe likely, interacting with mass numbers of people that you don't know, right? Moving from connected to a possible viral world. Now, by what mechanism do you ask? Essentially, the like button. Okay, this simple change, along with a few others, fundamentally changed the purpose of social media, transformed it into the highly addictive version that we have today. Not only do we know what happened, we know when this happened. Right around 2010, with the emergence of the App Store, the introduction of the like button on Facebook and Instagram. Now, what evidence do we have of this? Right, we've all seen the blank stares. We've seen the people walking into walls while looking at their cell phones. We've seen the traffic accidents. We've seen the texting while driving. But what does the data actually say? And we won't go into song and verse here, but Haidt presents many, many compelling graphs and illustrations in the book, which all point to a similar starting point. Rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide, all virtually unchanged across populations, across age groups. And then in 2010, we see a dramatic shift with rates in all sorts of negative outcomes changing all at once, all in the same direction and not the right one. The bad news is it's probably worse than you think, certainly worse than I thought. We are living through what is likely the greatest erosion in the mental health of teenagers and young people in recorded history. And again, just grab yourself a copy, take a look at some of these numbers, and grapple with them. Okay, really grapple with them. We're going to just discuss a few, but there's so much in this book. Major depression among teens, up 145% since 2010 for girls, up 161% for boys. Emergency room visits for self-harm, up 188% for girls since 2010, a 48% increase for boys. Suicide rates, up 91% for boys since 2010, up 167% for girls. Rates of anxiety among college students up 134% since 2010, hitting those in the 18 to 25 range the hardest. Just really think about that. Now, I've echoed this point before, but historically, young people were the happiest, most carefree of any demographic, with rates of happiness highest among teenagers. For good reason, right? All the freedom, the physical strength, the energy, making money for the first time probably in your life, maybe even a car, but without the responsibility of kids, a career, or a mortgage. People typically in their 40s and 50s have been the most stressed and least happy. Also obvious, right? They've got kids, they've got teenagers, they've got elderly parents, they have a career, right? Mortgages. And oddly, we've seen a complete inversion here. People my age, people in their 40s and even in their 50s, have gotten happier. But our young people have moved in the opposite direction. They've become worse off. Why is that? I've said it before, but something is off. The very nature of the experience of young people has been distorted, perverted actually, and it has been done with almost no realization or pushback. Let's hear directly from Haidt in a quote that more so than any other in the book just really illustrates to me how far the situation has gone off the rails. Quote, social media platforms don't enforce their minimum age of 13. Children are free to do as they please and exchange messages and photos with unknown adults. Pornography sites also welcome children as long as they check a box to say that they are 18 or older. Porn sites will show them how to have anal sex long before they've had their first kiss. Let that sink in for a second. That's your son, your daughter. It's their peers. Now, these are uncomfortable ideas, but the first step in attempting to solve the problem, in my humble opinion, is waking up to the reality of how bad the situation actually has become. Which leads us to the obvious question. How did we get here? And in order to answer that question, we have to begin at the beginning, with childhood. It's fascinating to me that this is essentially where Haidt starts, the impact on childhood. What he refers to as the great rewiring of childhood, moving from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. Free play is essential for healthy child development, but it's quickly being replaced by a phone-based, digital-based, weaker alternative. Now, why is that? In short, it's because of one of the key insights of this book, which I agree 1000% with, and that is that the digital world has become more exciting and enticing, while at the same time, the real world, the non-digital world, has become less interesting, less enticing, okay, boring and neutered. All right. Now, I think this is one of the key insights from Jonathan Haidt's work. Importantly, this has operated as sort of a push-pull, that just as smartphones and apps and this new form of highly engaging, highly addictive social media became mainstream, we, as a collective group of well-intentioned parents, of teachers, of guardians, and lawmakers, you could say, decided to water down the real world, right? Make it even more boring. Good intentions, but disastrous outcomes. Why? Well, and Haidt goes into this in detail, but because children are anti-fragile, or at least they should be. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this idea of antifragility or of anti-fragile, the term originally comes from Nassim Taleb, who also is a professor at NYU, and he's into finance, a very intelligent, very smart guy. He's written several very popular books, The Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, and he introduces this idea of anti-fragile, which is not quite robust. Right? So if you think about the word fragile, well, what would be the opposite of fragile? And the opposite of fragile wouldn't be something that resists breaking, right? Something being fragile is something that breaks easily. But anti-fragile would go a step further. It would be something that actually gets better with stress, right? So rather than cracking under stress, which is what fragile would be, anti-fragile would not only resist stress, it would actually gain from stress. And that is essentially what anti-fragility is in a nutshell. It's a term that's gone far beyond the realm of finance. And you can think about your immune system as anti-fragile. An immune system that grows up in the absence of any stress, of any external threats, will become very weak. But an immune system that is overstressed, obviously, will fail. So there's this realm in the middle somewhere. I don't know if you could quite describe it as a happy medium, but there's some place between the realm of zero stress and maximum stress that would be ideal. And that certain systems actually gain and actually improve under stress. Okay, so that's anti-fragility in a nutshell. And children, or at least healthy children, should be raised anti-fragile, right? They gain from some stress. A child that has never experienced any stress, whether physical or mental or emotional, is going to be left very unprepared for the real world, right? As uncomfortable as it can be for a parent to see their child going through something difficult, we all recognize that with hindsight, some difficulty is important. It's important to development for children. It's also important for us, right? Muscles, another anti-fragile system, right? Stressing the muscle is what enables the muscle to grow. It's the stimulus that causes growth. Now, Haidt introduces a related concept of safetyism, something akin to helicopter parenting, I guess you could say, in which we as a society have significantly reduced physical risk for most children in the real world, say like the last 50 years. As I mentioned, as scary as it can be for any parent, children need physical risk. We as a society have slowly begun starving them of this. And by analogy, Haidt introduces this biosphere experiment. This is something I had heard about tangentially, but I'd never really gone very deep into. I think this takes place in Arizona, where scientists attempted to create an artificial habitat, right? Completely artificial, cut off from the rest of the world, sort of everything self-sustaining within this dome, right? This giant dome. And, they mapped it all out. They had it to where at least they thought it was going to work perfectly on paper. They had trees, they had sunlight coming in, they had water. And one of the things that they discovered as they started planting some of these trees and the trees started to grow is that the experiment failed. And the experiment failed for somewhat unexpected reasons, and that was a lack of wind. And that in order for trees, certain types of trees, to grow and to grow strong and healthy, they actually need wind, right? They need some resistance to break, to sort of brace against in order for these trees to grow big and strong, right? So by analogy, our children need the same, right? They need some resistance. They need some wind. They need some risk. They need some actual pain and stress in order to grow into strong, actualized, healthy human beings. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the book are some of the pictures of these old playgrounds. And if you consider the playgrounds of the 1950s, 1960s, and even frankly, my childhood, which was in the 1980s and 1990s, compare that to the playgrounds of today, and it's just night and day, right? The playgrounds of old, not even that old, were risky, right? There were things that you could get hurt on. I grew up in Ithaca, New York, and they've got this great playground, community park, I think what's it called, Stewart Park. And I remember going there as a child. And for people that grew up when I grew up, we all had the merry-go-round, right? And the real merry-go-round, where you'd have a bunch of kids all running along the side, and you'd sort of run this giant spinning disc in the middle. And as you're running, then eventually, one person would hop on, right? And then people would be sort of running and jumping and sort of leaping on. And it was a complete disaster, right? Every year, multiple kids would break arms and worse. But it was the most fun thing, right? And it was part of the reason why it was fun is it combined some real risk. You think about the sorts of monkey bars and things that kids would climb on that were actually very high. The rope. I don't know if anybody had the rope in gym class when they were a kid, but I mean, this was a mainstay of gym classes throughout the United States for decades. You'd climb this rope. It went from the ground to the ceiling in the gymnasium, might be 20, 30 feet up. And with no safety equipment and just like this sort of cartoonishly small, 3-4 inch foam mat at the bottom, sort of like a tumbling mat, a kid without any safety equipment would climb to the top of that rope and they would climb back down. And not every single kid climbed all the way up, obviously. Some kids couldn't do it physically or they just couldn't do it mentally, right? It was just scary. But there was real risk, right? Games like paintball, dodgeball, all these games that kids played and still do play some, I want to be fair. But part of the reason why those games are so exciting and were so exciting is because of the risk. Now you compare that to the playgrounds and the games that are encouraged or placed into a school setting today, and it's not even close. Just not even close. I mean, Haidt talks about this playground. I think it's in California, and it has the rules for tag. There are 9 of them. Okay, 9 rules for playing tag. And let me just give you a taste for what some of these rules are. Okay, now you all remember tag from when you were a kid. And let's see if these rules match with what you played when you were younger. Okay, tag rules. Include everyone. Resolve disagreements with rock, paper, scissors. Practice good sportsmanship. 1 finger touch. No ball tag. If a player doesn't want to play, then the other players must respect it. Tag games stay outside on the yard. Tag cannot be played out of bound areas or through other games. When the bell rings, all players stop and students freeze, then walk to line. Okay, now we could say that, yeah, maybe these are part of sort of the game of tag, and maybe these rules are good, maybe they're not. But I think the point that Haidt makes is that they have to write these down, right? That part of what's going on here is that adults feel the need to interject into every aspect of these children's lives, including a game like tag, right? That a young child from the age of 4 or 5 could understand quite easily. But we need 9 rules posted in order to resolve any potential dispute that arrives from tag. And part of the reason that children play games is so that they can learn these skills that they will need as adults, right? Partially because they're fun, of course. But part of the reason why games exist, and this is one of the major ideas underpinning this thesis that a play-based childhood is important, is essential, is that where do they learn communication skills? Where do they learn negotiation skills, dispute resolution? How hard is too hard? How can I play in a way that I strive to win, but I play in a way that doesn't make me a complete social pariah? All of these sort of nuanced, unspoken conversations, they really can't be boiled down to 9 rules on a board. They're sort of socially enforced. They're learned through experience. So to me, this is just a very, very powerful example of what Haidt is talking about when you compare the playgrounds of your childhood versus the playgrounds and play experiences of kids today. If this is what tag has become, and we know we'll get into it, but we know what the online world has become, how exciting, how liberating, how thrilling. It doesn't compare, right? Of course, the online world has become everything other than that. But the real world has become so watered down that tag becomes barely recognizable, right? Just sort of let that sink in. The bottom line is that for the last 50 years, we've dulled down childhood. We've over-policed it. We've castrated it to the point that, let's be honest, compared to the digital world, social media, the dopamine and endorphin rush from a like or a comment or a share, the rush of violent video games. For most kids, from school to structured after-school activities to homework to dinner to bed, the real world, well, it kind of sucks. And according to Haidt, the massive irony is that at the same time we've become hypervigilant about threats in the real world, most parents are completely oblivious to threats in the online world. We've erected a massive, impenetrable fortress against risk in the real world, the kinds of risks that, frankly, we've evolved to take, that have shaped humanity for thousands of years, but we've given them an express pass to the full Monty of risks in the digital world, with the ability to check a box on a phone as the only speed bump along the way. Haidt smashes this point home with the story of a 14-year-old girl named Isabel, who wrote about her experience in the free press, which just really brings home this point. She says, quote, "I was 10 years old when I watched porn for the first time. I found myself on Pornhub, which I had stumbled across by accident, and returned to it out of curiosity. The website had no age verification, no ID requirement, not even a prompt asking me if I was over 18. The site is easy to find, impossible to avoid, and became a frequent rite of passage for kids my age. Where was my mother? In the next room, making sure I was eating 9 differently colored fruits and vegetables on the daily. She was attentive, nearly a helicopter parent, but I found online porn anyways. So did my friends." End quote. Age 10. All of her friends did too. Just let that sink in here. And again, was her mom a bad mom? No, it sounds like she was quite conscientious. But the point is that that same conscientious parent, and it could have been any of us, highly attuned to risks in the real world, highly attuned to the importance of providing good experiences in the real world, completely missing the boat when it comes to the risks and terrible experiences waiting for a 10-year-old child in the online world. Now, I get it. You're probably thinking, but my kids don't even have a phone. They don't have access to the internet. The odds of them stumbling onto a porn site is pretty low. And you might be right. But consider this. How about their friends? How many 10, 12-year-olds have a smartphone? Well, it turns out a lot, actually. According to a 2025 Pew Research study, 29% of 8 to 10-year-olds and 57% of 11 to 12-year-olds own their own smartphone. Okay? So depending on the age, actually, maybe most. Now hear me out. Might one of them, in an attempt to be funny or mischievous, show your kid something on a bus ride, between class, or after school? Maybe Pornhub, just to get a reaction? Of course, it's not difficult to imagine. In fact, it's hard to imagine that not happening. Just think about your own childhood. Where did you learn about so many of the things that you learned about that combined a bit of risk, a bit of thrill, perhaps a bit of rule breaking? Cigarettes, booze, pot, how to light an M80. Did you learn it from your parents? Probably not. You likely learned it from your peers. Now, I know that for adults, reasonable people can disagree about the place of pornography in society. That is not the point of what Haidt is saying here, and I agree with him. But it's that this window of time, this sensitive period in which a child is learning for the very, very first time about things like romance, flirting, and what a successful relationship looks like, and what is, quote, normal on these ideas. What will become their frame of reference as teens and adults is being shaped not only by what they see in the adults in their lives and of their peers, but also now this incredible, extreme, and ahistoric graphic online world in many cases. I don't mean to be gross, and I know these are very, very disturbing ideas for many parents, but we should not be naive here. Again, overprotection in the real world, but underprotection in the online world, okay? That is an obvious mistake. We're going to take this a little bit farther, okay? Now, I know this episode has already been darker than most of our episodes so far, and I'll say it now and I'll say it again, but it's always darkest before the dawn, There's a reason that saying exists. Okay, so bear with me a little bit. There's certainly light at the end of this tunnel, but let's talk about one more obvious and uncomfortable point for any parent. Haidt points to a 2019 New York Times piece highlighting the, quote, boom in online photos and videos of children being sexually abused. A record 45 million images were flagged last year alone, exposing a system at a breaking point and unable to keep up with the perpetrators. I mean, honestly, it's hard to even find words as to what to say to this, other than just, if you were a parent, it is time to wake up to the risks of the online world. The solution is not to overprotect in the real world, and we'll get into this as we get into solutions. But certainly some protections in the online world are important. And ultimately, who are we going to trust to safeguard the minds, the bodies, and the future of our children? We can trust Meta, TikTok, Snapchat? Well, I think we know the answer to that. So one point that Haidt really nails here is that the harms from social media and smartphones tend to impact girls and boys differently. So this is important. Okay, for girls, the hook, if you will, the thing that just draws them in to this online virtual world tends to come in the form of social media apps with a visual focus. This is largely Instagram and TikTok. In a bit, we're going to talk about why this is specifically, 4 reasons particular that Haidt outlines as to why this might be the case. But for now, it's enough to just say this tends to be the hook. These visually oriented social media apps tend to really draw girls in. Whereas for boys, the hook tends to come in the form of online video games and pornography. Of course, we are speaking in broad terms here. Obviously, there will be girls who struggle with pornography, and there will be boys who, say, doom scroll on Instagram. But we are speaking in averages, population data, okay? And a couple of outliers don't invalidate the trend. All right, so let's just be very clear about that. And while I get the temptation to argue that there is no difference in the genders, that is not the case as presented here. And for the record, I don't accept that either. Okay, are both genders equal? Obviously. Equally valuable, equally worth it, of course. Obviously. Just not debatable in my view. Are they exactly the same? Well, of course not. Haidt argues that the nature of these biological differences, social influences, along with the very nature of the technology itself, is what creates and sets up this unique set of harms by genders. So what are these harms? We've touched on them a bit, but let's now dive into a bit more detail. And let's start with the girls. Now again, I'd highly encourage you to grab a copy of The Anxious Generation, give it a read, share it with a friend. Highly, highly recommend it. Okay, Haidt has done incredible work here. But he outlines 4 specific reasons why girls are particularly vulnerable to the ills of social media. Okay, social media specifically. So first, girls are more affected by visual social comparison and perfectionism. 2, girls' aggression is more relational as opposed to physical. Okay, this is a point that I've heard Jordan Peterson make as well. That when you look at confrontation between, say, boys or men, Peterson makes the point that there's always this implied threat of violence, this implied threat of aggression. And when you look at, say, masculine dominance, meaning like masculine competition with one another and the assertion of dominance of one male, human male versus the other, you tend to notice, at least in our modern civilized society, that it tends to be who can either threaten violence without fear of violent reprisal or say something without fear of violent reprisal. And whoever can do that is typically the person who is more dominant in the situation. Okay, and I'm speaking very generally here, okay? Very, very generally. Whereas for girls, when a girl or a woman attempts aggression, it tends to be more reputation destruction, right? It tends to be nasty gossip. It tends to be rumors. It tends to be the attempt to ostracize an individual from a group through reputational destruction. No, I'm inclined to agree with this. I haven't thought incredibly deeply about this, but at least the case as presented by Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson, I think there's some merit there. When I look back in my own personal life, I have seen this trend. Point number 3, girls more easily share emotions and disorders. Now, why does this matter? Haidt makes a very interesting point about female feeling as being more, quote, contagious than male feelings. Okay, now bear with me for a bit because this one is very fascinating. And he points to data that would suggest, and research that would suggest, that when a man, say, becomes depressed, it doesn't really affect the other men or the other people in his lives. Okay, again, speaking in broad terms here, but if a man is depressed or anxious, for whatever reason, it doesn't spread to his social network. But when a woman is depressed or anxious, it tends to have the effect of spreading to other women and even other men within her social sphere, right? So in essence, women's feelings tend to be more contagious. And because women are more likely to share their feelings and share those feelings online and what's going on with them personally online, we get this effect of a contagion, meaning that psychological difficulties with one person can spread to other people. Okay, now again, painting with a broad brush here, but again, a very, very interesting point. The fourth is that girls are more subject to predation and harassment. Okay, I don't really think this is debatable. I think that in the physical world, in the real world, of course, but in the virtual and in the online world, I mean, it's 10x, it's 1,000x, it's 1,000,000x. I mean, the number of stories that you hear from friends, from family members in this book of the harassment and the unwanted advances. I mean, compared to the online world, I mean, Me Too is nothing, right? I mean, it's just nothing. The amount of harassment that women and girls experience online. The bottom line is that the more time a girl spends on social media, the more likely she is to be depressed. Okay, by a lot, right? It's a stepwise function. Haidt presents a lot of evidence to support this point, but he says, quote, the more time a girl spends on social media, the more likely she is to be depressed. Girls who say they spend 5 or more hours each weekday on social media are 3 times as likely to be depressed as those who report no social media time, end quote. Okay, 3x. It's a major, major difference. We've already discussed rates of anxiety, self-harm, and suicide, but let's not forget the massive uptick in eating disorders driven by algorithms suggesting content which promotes anorexia, all part and parcel of the online experience for girls. And I keep asking myself, why? Like, what are we doing? What other place in society, what other area of life would we accept that? Where else would we allow and expose our young people to that sort of psychological and emotional risk? For the upside of what exactly? The benefit of, I don't know. You tell me, sharing pictures? With whom? And for what reason? And the whole thing, when you take a step back, just seems like sheer madness. And that's just the girls. We haven't even touched on harms to boys. And in short, the virtual world is quite literally consuming our boys. And to unpack this, we've got to go back and dive a little bit deeper into this idea of declining risk and excitement in the real world. Right? This combined with easy overstimulation in the virtual world, this is playing out with boys and young men on a grand scale. Now, I know this is an oversimplification, but there's a lot of truth to the idea that one important aspect of childhood is to prepare children, to give them the low stakes at-bats, to practice, if you will, for the skills and attributes they will need as adults. This is not just with humans either, okay? This is all across the animal kingdom. Baby lions will stalk each other and then pounce as if they're hunting or fighting. Puppies growl, bark, play tug of war. Baby lambs will run, jump, and headbutt each other, right? They are learning the communication, developing their muscles, their senses. And of course, they're playing at the same time, right? But it's practice for the real thing when you really boil it down. And of course, for human beings, traditionally, this was no different. The traditional roles of men and women, you could see the quote practice or the quote at bats in some of the games that children played, whether it was playing with dolls, playing house or dress up, or roughhousing, or even organized sports. It is on this small scale, with critically low consequences of failure, that social skills, negotiation, communication, and nuance are built and developed. Where children confronted fears, both physical and emotional, and of course, learned the art of romantic relationships, all built in the real world, the starting place of play. And of course, so much of this foundation, so much of this nuance, the skill of the small failures is experienced before puberty because it's difficult and because humans take a long, long time to mature. And this process can be uncomfortable, as we all know, to not get it right, to feel rejection, to go unnoticed. But in the real world, there is this strong push-pull dynamic, right? There's this strong push to overcome these setbacks, to overcome this discomfort. And that push is human. It's biological. It's to secure resources. It's the desire to be seen as brave and as competent among your peers, the desire for friends and relationships, and of course, for sex. The biological imperative to pass along your genes. But the virtual world, especially during childhood and puberty, offers something incredibly seductive for boys and young men. It offers the modern-day siren's call, pulling men and boys from the real world with the promise of easy benefits without any risk of failure, embarrassment, or rejection. Why ask the girl? Why risk rejection? Why overcome fear when you can simply, quote, satisfy your biological imperative? Yes, I am talking about that one, the big one, right? The reason we all exist, whether you believe it's by evolution or by design, it is important. When you can simply extinguish that flame, simply snuff it out at any time with literally no effort through the use of ever-intensifying pornography, and mind you, this is all before AI, that natural push-pull, it has been broken. And I'll be honest with you about something. I am seeing this as a much bigger issue than I ever imagined. We'll do an entire episode on testosterone and how you can optimize your testosterone naturally. Right? I've sort of teased this before, and I've said this before. But testosterone is not simply a hormone that makes men horny or want to fight all the time. Okay, that's not what it is. Sure, there's an aspect of that, but by and large, what testosterone is primarily, and I'm borrowing directly from Dr. Andrew Huberman here because I really like the way that he tees this up, is that testosterone is the hormone responsible for making striving feel good for men and women. Okay, men and women. It is the hormone that makes it feel good to strive, to push. Okay, that's what it is. And this is incredibly important. In short, pornography kills your testosterone. I'm not the first person to say this, and I certainly won't be the last. But if you are feeling flat, or somebody you know is feeling flat, feeling less drive, and of course I am talking sexually, but also non-sexually, right? Also in life. If you are a user of pornography, that is your primary needle to move. And this isn't a moral statement here, okay? No judgment. I've said this before and I'll say it again, okay? It's not about shame. It's not about judgment. It's not about the morality of pornography specifically. It's about effective and optimized versus struggling, okay? That's what it's about. So the damaging effects of pornography have been on my radar for a while from a physical and a mental performance perspective. But the broader social implications, just the terrible cost that young people are paying through distorted perceptions and in their relationships, a hijacking of their dopamine and reward centers, and a crushing down of romantic relationships and male pursuit in the real world, this is not a good thing. Okay? I assure you, this is not a good thing. We can all see that there is a balance here, that too much of the stereotypical male pursuit in the real world, not a good thing, right? The catcalling at women, the pawing, a lot of what came out of the early Me Too movement. Okay, this is important. But we can also see that tipping the scale too far in the other direction is not a good thing either. I think this is probably the first time in my lifetime when we are waking up to a world in which we might actually have too little male pursuit. Now, I will say this has not been on my radar for a long time, for obvious reasons. I'm happily married, I've got an amazing wife, and I have awesome kids. I've been out of the dating scene for decades at this point. But I have kids, I've got young ones, and this matters. And between the distortions in the dating world created by the dating apps and the quote free, unfettered access to highly engaging pornography, what I have started to discover, and many of you may already be ahead of me on this, is that it is an incredibly difficult time for young people to learn the skills, and yes, I do mean skills, of dating and relationships. So we've got to wrap our heads around the nature of this issue, speak up, start coming up with solutions. The balance is way off on this. Okay, it's just my take. Let me know your thoughts because maybe, hopefully I'm wrong. I don't think so. I don't think I'm missing something. And in fact, I have an upcoming episode where we're going to go more in depth on this subject. Okay, not specifically on pornography and predation, but just on the nature of the challenge of romantic relationships for young people. Okay, this is hugely important, even if you're not in the dating world. You got kids, you got grandkids. This matters. It matters a lot. I admit that I'm sort of an odd person to be weighing in on this subject. But anyone who tells you that romantic, friend, and long-term relationships have nothing to do with leading an optimal, healthy life, well, I'd like to hear what they have to say, but I just don't think there's any argument there. Okay, I'll just be honest. Okay, so things got a little dark there. Let's circle up, come up for air, and remember, it's always darkest before the dawn. As I said from the start, there are many, many reasons to be optimistic. We've talked about some specific harms to girls, specific harms to boys. We've discussed why the impacts on childhood are so damaging. But now I want to shift gears and I want to talk about what we can do. Okay, what are some of the answers to this challenge? What can we do as individuals, as parents, and as families? And here Haidt breaks down the answer into 3 categories. Okay, I want to discuss some of his explanations and some of his ideas, and then I want to leave you with a few of my own. Okay, I mentioned from the beginning that I think there's at least one maybe critical aspect of the solution that I believe may be missing with respect to Haidt. So I want to talk about some of his thoughts, and then I'd like to share some of my own as well. So Haidt breaks this answer into 3 categories: governments and technology companies as 1, 2, schools, and 3, parents. Okay, and I don't want to completely steal Haidt's thunder here. Again, I just highly encourage you to grab a copy of The Anxious Generation and read it for yourself. I've been incredibly encouraged that as I've spoken with many of my friends and peers that have children, particularly young children. This book is on their radar. Many of them have already read it, and many of them, like me, are attempting to wrap their heads around this issue and come up with solutions for themselves and for their families. Okay, so let's talk about each of these categories, starting with government and technology companies. Okay, the biggest driver here is really around true age restriction on full access to the internet. Okay, right now, access to the internet, the approved age for access to the internet is 13, which when you think about that in the context of every other right, this is laughably low, right? The amount of harm that can come to a child on the internet easily rivals the physical world at this point. And how many other aspects of human life do we give somebody full access at age 13? I can't think of a single thing, right? Maybe going into a PG-13 movie without a parent, but that's probably it. So what Haidt proposes, and the good news is many governments have already made a move towards this, is lifting that age from 13 to 16. Okay, so that would limit a child's access to social media, limit a child's access to certain aspects of the internet from the age of 13, move that up to 16. Okay, and what I will say about this is I think it's a good idea in theory, but this obviously can't be the only aspect, right? And for the obvious reason that, well, the age is already 13, but there are plenty of examples of children on, say, TikTok or on Instagram that are under that age. And Haidt acknowledges that, right? So while I agree that this is an important part of the solution, this cannot be the only part of the solution. The second area of focus is on schools. And here is where we start getting into this collective action problem. Okay. And what Haidt proposes here, I think, is reasonable. I think he actually outlines something like 4 steps. But ultimately, what it comes to is encouraging more playful schools as opposed to phone-based schools. And maybe even in some cases, or in all cases, phone-free schools. Right? I mean, most of us grew up in a day when we didn't have access to phones. Certainly not in school. There are many technological solutions around this, calling watches, other things that could be done for parents and children to be able to get in touch in, say, like an emergency. But I think the case that a child must have a smartphone in a school, I think, is incredibly weak. And the good news is that many schools, whether they're private schools and even some public schools, are moving away from enabling smartphones in school. From what I understand, most of the teachers want this, most of the administrators want this, and I think even many of the parents want it. Yes, do you want to be able to get in touch with your child in the case of an emergency? Yes, when your brain starts going to places like school shootings and other horrific things that can happen in school, obviously. But I think by and large, this is something that is gaining a lot of momentum. There's a lot of light at the end of this tunnel. So Haidt proposes a couple of things here, which I think by and large I would agree with. Okay, the last category is on parents. What can parents specifically do to help the situation, to help tip this balance in the right direction? And in short, it's to bring back more adventure and more autonomy and even risk in the real world, while relying less on the virtual world. Okay, we all get how these devices are incredibly enticing. They're cheap entertainment. It's incredibly easy to have your child occupied and engaged on a phone or on a device and not facing any risk out in the real world. But I think as we've seen, and as I've hit home and as Haidt has hit home, this is an incredibly short-sighted strategy. It's only a matter of time, or they may already be there, to where the real risks to your child in the virtual world overshadow the risks in the real world. If there is a common theme, a single thread which underpins this incredible shift from the real world to the virtual world, it's that the real world has been made overly safe, de-risked, frankly boring, while the virtual world has become more exciting, more stimulating, and highly addictive. We are out of balance, and fundamentally, any solution is about restoring that balance. This, to me, is just an incredible insight from Jonathan Haidt. Smartphones and social media are a cheap, ever-available form of entertainment and distraction. And here's the thing. It's not just our children who become addicted and hooked on them. We as parents also have to audit our own use of smartphones and social media. How many hours a day? How many hours a day do we spend staring at the screen? How often do our young children see us looking at these small devices as if they are the most fascinating, incredible, and special things that we own? Why would they assume any differently? And I'm not judging, of course. I am guilty as well here. But Haidt is correct. What we model for our children will inform their choices as we get older. Something that comes top of mind when I think about this subject is a conversation I've had with some parents where they talk about why it's difficult for the children to eat healthier. The children, they just won't eat healthy food. And either they volunteer, when you probe a little bit, you come to find that the parent will make something like chicken, rice, and broccoli for the kid. But then the parents will sit down to like a frozen pizza, right? And so you're like, well, of course, right? Of course it is a do as I say, not as I do. But how well does that work? Again, just think about your own experience. How often were you likely going to do the things that your parents told you to do as opposed to do the thing that you saw them doing? Right? The modeling is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful. Now, this brings me to a related point. I teased this at the beginning that I believe that there is one thing that we could add to what Haidt has presented here, right? One mild addition that I think should be included as part of the solution that I'd like you to consider. And that is not only allowing, enabling more risk, more adventure in the real world for children, but also modeling and embodying more risk and adventure in the real world for parents. Again, it's not what you say, it's what they see. So if you are a parent with young kids, as I know that many of you are, is your virtual world more exciting, engaging, and addictive than your real one? If that is, and I suspect that it is for many of us, then this is your wake-up call to embrace your adventure in the real world, to take the trip, to sign up for the class, to buy the horse. Yeah, maybe that's just me. But the antidote to the sucking sound of the virtual world consuming the minds, attention, and lives of our young people is the incredible, awesome, adventurous real world. And truth be told, it doesn't even compare. One of the things I was very struck by when my children were little, we lived in San Clemente, California. And most days I would take the kids down to the beach just to walk on the beach, dig in the sand, swing on the swings. And every now and again, they'd have a truck, like one of these big bucket trucks, the guy with a cherry picker on it, doing tree work. And it didn't matter what was going on, how exciting, somebody was surfing, somebody looking at a screen, it didn't matter. But the minute that truck was up, the guy's up there, he's got the chainsaw, he's trimming palms or whatever the guy was doing, it was like every single kid just sat and stared. And they just watched, this guy work. And I'm most struck by when you see young kids and you see somebody doing something that's physically risky in the real world, whether it's a fight, all eyes are on the fight. If it's somebody working with heavy equipment, a steamroller, a dump truck, kids are fascinated by that. And they're transfixed. And I think that illustrates the power of the real world. That things that might be a little risky, skateboards and go-karts and doing things like Brazilian jiu-jitsu and martial arts and asking out a girl. Yes, all of those things come with risk. All of those things come with the possibility of heartbreak and with hurt. But by insulating our children from those and by not embodying those ourselves, we are really, really doing our children and the future of humanity a tremendous disservice. Okay, so we're going to wrap this episode for today. As always, thank you for the listen. If you are enjoying the show, I would love a share, a like, or a subscribe on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. Thanks, and I'll see you again next time.